And now a reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 21, starting at verse 22. And if men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart, and yet no harm follow, he shall be surely fined according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follow, then thou shalt give life for life. Okay, why am I reading to you from an obscure set of laws in the book of Exodus, chapter 21? I am going to explain over the course of 2 episodes the answer to that question. The top line item, the basic idea, is that I want to talk to you about abortion. Abortion is obviously one of our major news items. We're talking about it all the time. There is a big court case, a Supreme Court case, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, which is currently working its way through the courts. They've heard oral arguments, and if the Mississippi law in question is upheld, then that would mean overturning it in whole or in part, Roe v. Wade and Casey, these 2 major landmark pro-abortion cases, pro-abortion rights cases. So there's a topical element here. But this is the classical education that you never knew you were missing. And so we don't just talk about the stuff that's in the news. We talk about what's underneath the stuff that's in the news. And abortion is maybe the most intense example of something that's going on everywhere in American politics and just in American life, like in the arguments you might find yourself having with your neighbor or at the school board or whatever. And this is a question of first principles. And so it's not just actually limited to abortion, but abortion is a great example of a place where the 2 sides argue about these sort of surface issues, right? Whether or not you can do an abortion at this time, or whether there's clean health clinics available in which to do abortions. But one of the reasons why the arguments never get anywhere is because underneath them, there are these first principle disagreements. So I want to talk about what I mean by a first principle. What is the tradition in the West of thinking about first principles? And that's going to be the whole of this episode, because it's really important. And like I say, it's not just limited to abortion. What is a first principle? How do we reason? How do we argue with one another? And why is it that when you argue without shared first principles, you never get anywhere? You just yell at each other more and more and take to the streets and fight, which is what we're currently doing. So that's just the first whole episode is just going to be about what a first principle is and how we find one, how we talk about them, how we understand them. And then the second episode is going to be all about how that is playing out in the abortion debate, how this disagreement on first principles, this mismatch between the most basic foundational bedrock of the argument, the starting point of both the pro-life and the pro-abortion argument, why those 2 things become so heated is because they don't agree on first principles. So once we've talked about that in this episode, then next week we're going to talk about what that looks like in practice in the abortion debate. But like I say, there are applications here all across the board, all sorts of arguments that we have about masking, about coronavirus, about whether we should go to war in Ukraine, about just any number of things. The reason why our politics is so heated, so intense right now is precisely because of this issue of the first principle. And so before we get to any of the politics, any of the news, any of that stuff, we just need to talk about what is a first principle. So let's get into it. Whatever business you are running, you need indeed to hire top quality candidates. There's so much that goes into running a business, and you're in it because you love it. So you love doing the research, you love checking out who to hire. But when you're low on hours and you still want to do a great job on hiring, Indeed are the folks that you go to for help. They are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. We use this at Soundfront. That's where we hire all of our best talent. So not me, obviously, but other people like producers and editors at Soundfront, all hired through Indeed. It is a great service that stick with you on every step of the hiring process. Find great talent through time-saving tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. Instant Match is a great one because as soon as you sponsor a post, you'll get a short list of quality candidates with resumes on Indeed that match your job description. This is how at Soundfront we find the best possible talent to make the shows that you love, and we use Indeed to hire the best candidates. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit only for Young Heretics listeners at Indeed.com/heretics. You got to go to that link, Indeed.com/heretics, to claim your $75 credit before March 31st. So limited time only, Indeed.com/heretics, and you'll get a $75 sponsored job credit. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. So, okay, what is a first principle? The term first principle is actually, when you analyze it etymologically, the term is actually it's a redundancy. It's two words that mean essentially the same thing. Principle, right, comes from this root princeps, first, and then first obviously means first. So it's the firstest of first things. It's the most first thing, and this is why you have, for example, like the Catholic journal First Things, right, is kind of echoing this idea of the first principle. And so in that sense, when it comes to argumentation and logic and philosophy, the first principle is the thing without which you cannot even begin. It's like everything has to have a starting point. We can't just go backward into infinity and keep asking, like toddlers do, you know, why? This is when a toddler chases you around the room and says, well, why can't I go to bed an hour later? And you say, well, because you'll be tired when you wake up. And then, well, why will I be tired when I wake up? Well, because, you know, because you need sleep, your body needs sleep. Well, why does my body need sleep, right? You can't just go on doing that forever. And at a certain point, you have to say to the toddler, because, right? Just because. That is the first principle. Once you've gotten to the thing where you say, like, just because, it just is, then you are dealing with something which is not the object of argumentation, which is not the thing that you reason your way toward in argument, but the thing which begins every argument. And because we are kind of hyper-rationalists in some ways in our current culture, because we think that you have to have a study to prove everything, we're very uncomfortable with the idea of first principles, because you actually, on some level, many of them cannot be proven in that way. That is, they can't be proven by virtue simply of, you know, going out and making a study and writing charts and taking statistical regression analyses and whatever. They're more fundamental than that. And they're the kinds of things that would condition which studies you would even do, right? Based on your first principles, you're going to know which questions to ask and which ones not to ask. And so this is why it so often becomes invisible in our debates, because we don't know that there is such a thing as a first principle. As another word for it is an axiom, right? A thing that begins. And so as per usual, when we're talking about formal logic, when we're talking about reasoning, it pays to start with our old pal, Uncle Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is not the first person, I don't think, to come up with the idea of a first principle full stop, but as usual, he sort of systematizes the idea in some of the most clear ways. So we're going to start with a classic passage from the Physics. Remember, physike in the ancient world is the study of things that happen naturally, by physis, that is spontaneously. But this is really just a broad methodological outline that Aristotle gives at the beginning of the Physics. And let's read from here. I have the translation of C.D.C. Reeve, which is a nice bound edition, and it's got good notes as well. So that's where we'll start. This is Book 1, Chapter 1, page 184a, 10. Since in all methodological inquiries in which there is knowledge, that is scientific knowledge, the Greek word here is episteme, we're going to get into that, as well as methodos, which is the method, right? In all methodical inquiries of things that have starting points, causes, or elements, it comes from knowledge of these. For we think that we know each thing when we know its primary causes and primary starting points all the way to its elements. It is clear that in the scientific knowledge of nature, our first task must be to try to determine the starting points. Whew. Now, as always with Aristotle, you get to the end of like one paragraph and it needs some unpacking. The two key words here, right, like I said, are method, methodos, and science or scientific knowledge is episteme. Episteme is the kind of knowledge, here for Aristotle, it's the kind of knowledge that has a kind of overarching theory about it that is systematic, that can be grasped in the whole and understood in all of its principles and its applications. The methodos is literally a word that means the road down which you walk. A hodos is a road, and meta is kind of outside of or beyond or above. So this is like the path that determines everything that you do. It's like the path that contains the whole science. So the methodos, or the method, is how you come to know things. And he's saying that in order to come to know things, you first have to find out what is called the archai, the beginnings or the first principles. And without those, you can't go anywhere. If you don't know what the first principle of science is, then you can't look into what the force of gravity is, because you don't even know there's such a thing as gravity. So how do you find this kind of basic starting point? He says, the natural route is from things that are knowable and more perspicuous to us to things that are more perspicuous and more knowable by nature, since the same things are not knowable to us as are knowable unconditionally. Again, what is he talking about? What on earth does he mean? Well, things that we see around us in the world are really obvious to us, right? Our feelings, our senses, our experiences, totally immediate. If I punch you in the jaw, you will not be able to deliver to yourself a philosophical argument that you are not in pain. It just won't work. No matter how beautifully you can reason about it, no matter how elegantly you can form your argumentation, if I punch you in the jaw, you know you feel pain. Similarly, if you're hungry, right, you cannot convince yourself that a block of wood is going to make you feel better. You know you need bread, you know you need meat. These are the things that are immediate and direct and knowable to us, right? This is what he says, clear to us, directly knowable. And yet, right, those things are actually, when you get down to them, they're very confusing, and they involve all sorts of different experiences, right? The experience of getting punched in the jaw, right, involves motion, it involves physical sensation, it involves maybe like seeing stars in front of your eyes, and all of those things have all kinds of different philosophical concepts like mixed up between them. And so what Aristotle says is the things that are knowable directly to us are different from the things that are knowable haplos, that is to say simply or in their entirety. Concepts like beautiful or true, right? Those things are actually knowable. Like you can grasp them in the mind and you can abstract them away from all the individual beautiful things or true things, right? This is like in the symposium, way back when we talked about the symposium, right? I mentioned that there's this ladder, right? The Diotoma, the sort of wise woman says to Socrates, there's this ladder that, maybe you fall in love with a beautiful boy, or fall in love with a lovely girl, right? But eventually, maybe your love cools. This happens to us. We get crushes, and then the love cools, and you see that there's another beautiful person, right? And suddenly you realize that this thing called beauty, which you experience directly in your knowable way to you, right? The very immediate way of, when your eyes pop out of your head and you go like, auga, you suddenly realize that can happen similarly to another person. Like you can have another kind of love. And in fact, other people have that kind of love for beauty for all sorts of other things. And suddenly you gradually start to realize that there is this thing called beauty that lives in all of those things. And it doesn't just live in people's faces or people's bodies. There's also beauty in architecture and beauty in a sunset. And even there are beautiful arguments that are so simple and elegant and lovely that as you work your way up this ladder, right, of coming to know all the different ways that something can be beautiful, eventually you come to what's called the beautiful in itself. And this is something like what Aristotle is talking about when he says that we climb up, right, from the things that are knowable immediately to us to the things that are truly and absolutely knowable, which is to say they're in their essence, they just are. Those are the first principles. Let me read to you another passage. Reeve has this great collection of passages from other works that helps us to understand this. So I'm going to read to you now another passage from the notes, and this is from his Metaphysics. It advances the work to proceed toward what is more knowable, for learning comes about for all in this way, through things by nature less knowable, toward ones that are more knowable. And just as with things in the sphere of action, the work is to begin from things that are good for each particular person, and make things that are wholly good for each particular person, so too the work here is to begin from things more knowable to oneself, and make the ones that are by nature knowable to oneself. But the things that are knowable and primary for particular groups of people are often only slightly knowable and have little or nothing of the being in them. Nonetheless, beginning from things that are poorly known but known to ourselves, we must try to know the ones that are wholly knowable, proceeding, as has just been said, through the former. And there are a bunch of, if you get this edition, this is the CDC Reeve edition, like I said, there are a bunch of other passages that you can kind of chase up to describe this concept. And it sounds super abstract and complicated, but when you actually apply it to real life, you realize it's an invaluable tool for living your life, right? Aristotle is talking not just about things like the beautiful and the good, but even the virtuous, right? So when we go around in our life and we see somebody giving up his meal, that, maybe there's limited food and maybe there's a famine, right? And somebody gives food to a beggar so that person or the child can have food and he won't, right? We see something in that, right? We see charity, we see generosity, goodness. And then we see something totally different. Like we see a soldier throwing himself on a grenade to prevent the death of his buddy in war. And those are two completely different scenarios, and yet we see something in them. What is that thing, right? It's sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not the soldier throwing himself on the grenade, and it's not the guy giving the food, but it's in each of those events. And so in the daily life that we live, our direct, immediate experience, there are these little threads, these little strands, right, of higher truth. And this is the way that by grasping onto our own experience, which is immediate to us, which is kind of irrefutable, right? Our lived experience, as they say. One reason why that phrase can be so pernicious is because people use it as if it's the be-all and end-all, right? My lived experience, my truth, you can't argue with it. And that's like a half-truth, as so often in our politics, right? That's a half-truth, because it's true that you're having that experience. But the thing that all argument proceeds from, the way to make any philosophical argument, to have any political argument, is to say, okay, so I have this experience. What's the thing in it that I'm experiencing that somebody else might experience somewhere else, right? And how can we recognize these shared threads of higher truth, like virtue, goodness, truth, beauty, right? All the stuff that this show is about. And so we're getting here to the methodos, the methodology of seeking those higher things. And notice that it's not the same as like proving something with hashtag facts and logic, right? Making a rational argument, because these are the things that we use to argue. What you have to even get to these first principles before you can even begin to argue. So you can't just go about saying like, you know, oh, I can prove to you that that virtue is good. Virtue is good doesn't need proof. Once you see virtue, once you experience virtue and clear away all the excess, the extraneous stuff, that in itself is enough of a proof, right? Virtue, the goodness of virtue is self-evident. And when I say that, right, that's a very different use of the term than we typically mean, right? Usually when we say self-evident, we just mean like anybody anywhere can see it. That's not the case. What self-evidence in itself really means is it's the thing that once you clear away all the accidents of your experience, once you recognize not only in your own daily life, but in the life of others and the wisdom of the ages and in the conversation with friends, right? You recognize the truths and the goodnesses and the beauties that are themselves common to all. And once you get there, then, as Socrates was when he gazed right at the beautiful in itself, the good in itself, you need no argument. There is no argument necessary to show you that good is good or beauty is good, right? Or virtue is good, right? Those things are self-evident because they are knowable in themselves. And those are the first principles. You cannot argue without them. And if you try, you will just be shouting at one another. Well, I think I believe in bodily autonomy. Well, I believe in the right to life. Actually, both people involved believe in bodily autonomy and the right to life, but the people that tell you that they're arguing about something else, right, women's health, whatever, they're throwing up a smokescreen to prevent you from getting down to these first principles, from arguing, well, what is this question of abortion, say, really about, or what is this question about lockdowns really about? Well, of course, it's it might prevent disease to go around wearing an N95 every second of your life, right? And so usually the pro-mask people will say like, well, this will prevent this much disease. And that in itself it's a distraction, right? Because that's not the question. The question is a deeper first principle question about how much risk is acceptable and what is the highest good of life, right? A classic first principle question. Do we believe that safety is the highest good? Or do we believe that there are certain other things that are higher than safety and can trump safety in certain instances, such as freedom, right? And those first principle questions are the ones that we are actually arguing about. And that's the reason why we're yelling at each other, right? Let me read to you a couple other, I think, really choice passages about how first principles work in debate. So I have been through like a million moves and remodels in the last year and a half, but one thing that has stayed constant is public goods and all of the stuff that I use to stock up my kitchen with. They look good literally everywhere. It's like magic. You move into an apartment, it looks good. You move into a house, it looks good. You buy a house, it looks good. You remodel, still looks great. They have this incredibly clean, eco-friendly design. You know that all the stuff that you get from public goods is free of the weird, gross chemicals that you find sometimes at the grocery store. I'm a health nut, so I just love to rely on public goods for healthy, eco-friendly, and innovative products. I particularly love to chow down on the chocolate-covered almonds. Those are top-notch. But Chad Cat, my cat, really, this is true, goes crazy for the freeze-dried duck nibs. And I just like saying freeze-dried duck nibs. So I worked out this great deal for just Young Heretics listeners with public goods. You get $15 off your first order with no minimum purchase. That's $15 of free stuff. They are so confident that you will absolutely love their products and come back again and again that they are giving you $15 when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout. That's PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics. Heretics, and you get $15 worth of free stuff to spend on freeze-dried duck nibs or dish soap or toilet paper or almonds to your heart's content. publicgoods.com/heretics. So we're talking about this idea, right, that the first principles, the things that are good in themselves, evident in themselves, clear, true in themselves, right, are not easy to see. Right? It's not like they're just, you can be born into the world and, like a kind of Rousseauian romantic child, you can just see the perfect truth right in front of you. That's not how the way in which first principles are self-evident. They're self-evident in a different way, which is that after long effort and study and thought, and indeed even prayer, right, once you gain access to those first principles, the clarity of them is undeniable, right? And one of the ways that we can argue for first principles instead of, arguing about like trying to prove our first principles is to give examples, right? And to show based on our own experience and the experience of others why such and such a thing might be good or bad. This is, you notice in the arguments, the oral arguments over abortion, Clarence Thomas began by asking these questions about, well, so here's a mother who took cocaine and she was guilty of child abuse because she, died from overdose, I think it was. And the child in her womb died too, right? And if we see the evidence, if we see the self-evidence of that ruling, that was right, then can we see from there the self-evidence of the life of the child and confronting people with actual case studies, right? Never mind the devoted ideologues, the people that are just, committed to a position simply, because, but people that are still on the fence about this. And there are a lot of people because there are difficult cases, right? The way that these arguments typically proceed when real people actually have them is by showing the experience of their life and saying, well, this happened to me, right? And can we say that it would be good for me to not be able to get an abortion or be able to get an abortion, right? Here's what Descartes, who is sort of sometimes thought of as the father of modern philosophy, here's what he has to say in a work called Principles of Philosophy. Now, this is, Descartes' a complicated guy, and we're going to get into him later because there are some ways in which I think he really ruined everything. But he does have this to say, which is I think true about first principles. He says, we must commence with the investigation of those first causes which are called principles. Now, these principles must possess two conditions. In the first place, they must be so clear and evident that the human mind, when it attentively considers them, cannot doubt their truth. In the second place, the knowledge of other things must be so dependent on them as that though the principles themselves may indeed be known apart from what depends on them, the latter cannot nevertheless be known apart from the former. It will accordingly be necessary thereafter to endeavor so to deduce from those principles the knowledge of the things that depend on them, as that there may be nothing in the whole series of deductions which is not perfectly manifest. What you can imagine here is that, as you're climbing your way from your own limited experience to, the experience of others around you, to the witness of the ages and the books that you read and the tradition, right? You're climbing your way up to these more essential fundamental truths. But your personal experience is very narrow, right? You just have this one experience of love, let's say. And then you hear about another kind of love that somebody else experienced. And then you hear that, one man went to the cross for love, right? And that widens your knowledge of love until you get to love in itself, right? And then once you're at this higher, wider conception of love, then you can climb back down into all these other different narrow corners, right? Because we use these wide, broad principles to apply in each individual case and instance. Here's another passage. This is from our old buddy C.S. Lewis, who writes a book called Miracles, which is about how your first principles conditions the arguments that you have. It does not, in fact, you cannot argue somebody out of their first principles except by example. And once somebody is committed to first principles, even experience sometimes can't convert them. So here's the opening of Miracles. Lewis writes, in all my life, I have met only one person who claims to have seen a ghost. And the interesting thing about the story is that that person disbelieved in the immortal soul before she saw the ghost and still disbelieves after seeing it. She says that what she saw must have been an illusion or a trick of the nerves. And obviously she may be right. Seeing is not believing. It's a great opening line, right? And kind of a surprising one. But think about the passage in the Gospels where a voice comes down from heaven, a thunderous voice comes down from heaven to proclaim, to proclaim the rightness of something Jesus has said. And then some people around Jesus say, oh, it was just thunder, right? The first principles of those people involved the fact that there's no such thing as voices from heaven, right? There's no supernatural intervention from the outside the order of nature into nature. And so all they heard was thunder because their first principles were conditioning even how they interpreted the evidence of their senses. So for this reason, says Lewis, the question whether miracles occur can never be answered simply by experience. Every event which might claim to be a miracle is, in the last report, something presented to our senses, something seen, heard, touched, smelled, or tasted. And our senses are not infallible. If anything extraordinary seems to have happened, we can always say that we have been the victims of an illusion. If we hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. What we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. It is therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled, as well as we can, the philosophical question. So Lewis is saying that before you even conduct experiments, before you even investigate your life, right, you have to know what things you're open to. And if you are trying to ascertain, for example, an answer to the question, are there miracles, right, then what you're doing is you're leaving that first principle question open, right? And when it's open, then you can go into the world and weigh the evidence up one way or another and see from your experience and the accounts and so forth, right? But if you've already decided that your first principle is there are no miracles, right? There's nothing supernatural. Then no amount of evidence is going to be enough to convince you. Here's another passage from the same book, right? That says the same thing. Here is an example of the sort of thing that happens if we omit the preliminary philosophical task and rush on to the historical. In a popular commentary on the Bible, you will find a discussion of the date at which the fourth gospel was written. The author says it must have been written after the execution of St. Peter because in the fourth gospel, Christ is represented as predicting the execution of St. Peter. A book, thinks the author, cannot be written before the events which it refers to. Of course it cannot, unless real predictions occur. There's a lot of the argument over whether Isaiah, the actual historical prophet from the 8th century BC, actually wrote all of the prophecy. A lot of that argument proceeds in these ways, right? Here's an example. Here's Cyrus, right? In the book, Cyrus lived hundreds of years after Isaiah. Therefore, somebody other than Isaiah must have written this book, right? But what Lewis shows is that at the very least, that's question begging, right? Lewis says, it is reason herself which teaches us not to rely on reason only in this matter. For reason knows that she cannot work without materials. When it becomes clear that you cannot find out by reasoning whether the cat is in the linen cupboard, it is reason herself who whispers, go and look. This is not my job. It is a matter for the senses. So here, the materials for correcting our abstract conception of God cannot be supplied by reason. She will be the first to tell you to go and try experience. Oh, taste and see. For of course, she will have already pointed out that your present position is absurd. As long as we remain erudite limpets, we are forgetting that if no one had ever seen more of God than we should have no reason even to believe him immaterial, immutable, impassible, and all the rest of it. Even that negative knowledge, which seems to us so enlightened, is only a relic left over from the positive knowledge of better men. Only the pattern which that heavenly wave on the sand left when it retreated. And I think Lewis is kind of like subtweeting David Hume here, obviously an anachronistic term, but when you subtweet somebody, that's when you like argue with him or diss him or put him down without actually tagging him on Twitter. And this happens all the time in academic discourse. An academic subtweet is when you lay out an argument that kind of tears apart somebody else's claims, but you don't actually mention it. So there's no mention of Hume here. But remember that when we read Hume, we had this whole argument against miracles that proceeded basically exactly according to these lines, right? That the experience of most of history is that there are no miracles. And so a new experience that we have, which looks like a miracle, is refuted by all the experience of history. But Lewis, of course, is saying that the very premises that you bring to your experience, the very first ideas, right, that you use to reason about the evidence of your senses, will condition the kinds of questions that you ask and even the kinds of answers that you give. Before we move this into the American context, because it's extremely important for the founding of America and for our present problem, I want to point out something interesting about faith, which I think for the early Christians was a first principle. Faith in Jesus, right? Again, whether you're a Christian or not, this is a fascinating matter of huge historical moment that bears directly on your life, right? It doesn't matter if you are yourself an atheist, right? You live in a country and indeed in a world, right? In a West that was built by people who thought of these things as foundational to their life and to their decisions. And so whatever you may say about what's going on in America right now, right? You got to know where you're coming from. You have to know what the background is for this. So let's look at the early Christians' attitude about faith and first principles. And then let's talk about America. So I've been arguing, using Lewis, using Aristotle, using Descartes, right? I've been arguing that there is this kind of outlook on the world that you build out of your experience, but which cannot ultimately be proven by reason alone or by experience alone. That you have to work your way up through reason from your experience to inform yourself, right? And using also, of course, the evidence of history and the wisdom of the ages, right, to inform yourself about what things are true in their totality. Finally, haplos, as Aristotle would say, right, purely and utterly, and in a self-evident way. That is, once you see them, once you gaze upon the true and the beautiful in themselves, everything is conditioned from then on by that, right? And of course, this is a lifelong journey. It's not like you're going to have necessarily have some, moment of rebirth or, some born again moment where you see it all at once, just like Socrates did. This is a lifelong process, but I'm just describing to you how your brain already works, right? The human mind already has to do this because we both believe in eternal principles, abstract principles, and we apply those abstract principles to our lives. And right now, even though we have all sorts of abstract principles that are smuggled into our public debates, like that, security is the highest good, or that autonomy is an ultimate good, right? We don't really admit that kind of reasoning is still possible for us because it's kind of religious reasoning. It's theological reasoning, right? Reasoning about the highest good is always theological reasoning, even if you don't talk about God. Because what is God if not the highest good, right? The thing before which all knees shall bend, that is the final truth that is incontrovertibly true, no matter who says otherwise, right? And so maybe you don't believe in God, but if you look at a murder happen, right? If you look at somebody killing, let's say, innocent people en masse, if you look at the Holocaust, if you look at the Soviet Gulag, right? You immediately respond to that saying, that is wrong. Thou shalt not, right? And that thou shalt not is smuggled in a secret highest principle that you have. There's nothing in nature that says that it's bad to kill an innocent person. There's nothing in nature that says that happens in nature all the time, right? Nature is just what happens spontaneously, just the machinery of life, right? It's human beings who have first principles that they derive from their experience, but then they apply to their experience, right? Those first principles, which are theological in the sense of being highest goods, right? Those first principles condition what we see when we see a murder, for example. We don't just see a physical event happening. We see a moral atrocity happening. And even if we deny the existence of God, we still reason in this way because that's the only way that we're able to reason. Reason herself, as Lewis says, teaches us to think like this. Now, what's really interesting to me about faith, right? The way that we typically talk about faith is that, well, it's like this sort of unprovable. It's just this passion that some people have, this feeling that some people have in their tummies, and there's an element of that, of course. Faith inspiration is given by the Holy Spirit. We do have there are matters of conviction that cannot be forced that come in their time. And yet the word for faith in the Bible is much richer and deeper than that. The Greek word is pistis, and the verb is pisteuo, right? I trust or I believe. And it's a kind of a wholesale reliance. You can rely on a person. You say, I think this person is trustworthy, or I rely on this rope, right, to hold me if I fall down the mountain, right? And I believe in this assent and this proposition. And so pistis is really this belief, right, that there is some bedrock. It's the belief in the thing that you trust when everything else fails, when your bank account is empty, when you are being chased from your home, when the worst that life has to throw at you comes. Pistis is the thing that you still trust will be true. That's your faith, right? And for some people, right, their faith is in their bank account. This is, of course, all over the Gospels, right? But some people secretly, in their heart of hearts, right, if they, if worse comes to worse, I guess I can buy a plane ticket out of here. I can buy a home somewhere else, right? Or if worse comes to worst, what? Well, I still have my my smarts to go on, right? I can still reason my way out of things. But of course, the truth is that all of those things fall apart, right? You lose your money, war happens, disease happens, terrible things happen that strip everything else away. And so for Christians, right, the pistis, the faith in God as revealed in Jesus, right, is this kind of bedrock first principle. I know that this is true, and therefore I reason out of it, as Aristotle reasons out of his archai, his first principles of truth and goodness and beauty and so forth. When the early Christians started arguing with the pagan philosophers, they were able to use this idea of pistis, of first principles of belief, to show the power of their faith. And this is really remarkable, and it's something that we've lost, I think, in modern Christianity, because we think of faith as just like a feeling that we have, or like a dance that we do or something, right? But here's how John Chrysostom, in his homilies on Paul's letter to the Romans, one of the great church fathers, right? Chrysostom writes, the arguments of the heathens are like some labyrinth or puzzles which have no end to them anywhere, and do not let the reason stand upon the rock, and have their origin in vanity. For being ashamed to allow of faith, and to seem ignorant of heavenly things, they involve themselves in the dust cloud of countless reasonings. He's arguing exactly what I just said about our modern debates, right? That we cannot admit that we have these absolute moral axioms, these first principles that we reason from. And because of that, because the philosophers refuse to admit that, to admit of pistis in this sense, faith in first principles, right? They are ashamed, and therefore they go around in circles. They just argue forever, which sounds a lot like our present debates, right? They enter into this labyrinth, these puzzles of reasoning, which have no end. I'm going to read to you one other passage about this, because I think it's something that Christians and non-Christians alike should stand to become aware of, right? That everybody has this kind of pistis, this kind of faith. The only question is, what is your faith in, right? Is it in your money? Is it in your own personal moral righteousness? Is it in God? What, right? What is your first principles, which is to say, what is your faith? I'm going to read to you now from the Life of Antony. This is by Athanasius, another church father who writes about one of the first ever, essentially monks in the true sense of the monachos, those who sought solitude as part of their extreme Christian practice. So here's the Life of Antony. I'm reading from a collection, a Penguin Classics collection of early Christian lives, which I thoroughly recommend. It's kind of, people don't read these anymore, but they're some of the most fascinating and revealing documents from the early church that tells you both how the church came into contact with the pagan world and into conflict with the pagan world, and what it was that eventually, I think, drove people to the faith in this improbable but world-changing way. So here's Life of St. Anthony. St. Anthony, who is this kind of uneducated hermit, is in contact with these brilliant pagan philosophers, just like Paul at the Areopagus, right? The Athenian philosophers, the Stoics, the Epicureans, they spent all their time debating and arguing. This is an act, right? And the same thing happens here. Here's a contact between Antony and those philosophers. Antony says, "Answer me, how is knowledge of God proved more clearly? By means of intricate arguments, or by the working of faith? And which comes first, the working of faith, or debate proceeding by means of arguments?" When they answered that the working of faith was more effective than discussion, and that this offered an accurate knowledge of God, he agreed that they had spoken well, for the working which derives from faith is produced by feelings in the mind, while dialectical argument depends on the skill of those who are setting it forth. Now, the most remarkable part of that exchange to me between Antony and the pagan philosophers is that they agree on something, right? They disagree about almost everything. They don't, the pagans don't believe that Jesus is God. They don't necessarily even believe there's one God or any God, right? But they agree that faith comes first, which sounds like this kind of, American evangelist proposition. So how can they possibly agree about this? Well, because pistis, right? First belief, right? First principle level belief, right? Has to come first for a philosopher or for a theologian. And everybody who argues from some set of first principles. And so Antony is basically saying you cannot argue your way to knowledge of God. You have to start with that knowledge, in some sense, ready-made from your experience. You have to kind of build gradually over time and meditation and prayer this experience of the good, right? And decide, plunk for something. Where is your highest good? Is it in your bank account? Is it in your smarts, right? Is it in your good looks, right? All of these things will pass away. Or is there something true, pure, immutable, and highest, right? That you will not desert, even if it's hard, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's, you know, if it costs you things, if it makes you a laughing stock, right? What is the pistis, the first principle, the highest truth from which all of your questions and all of your answers proceed? That is the thing that we are fundamentally at odds about in America. And anything that doesn't take that into account, any public argument or debate about who's going to wear which mask, or, you know, who's going to go to what kind of school, or what we're going to teach in school, or, you know, whether abortion is going to be legal or not, any public argument that does not acknowledge, right, that we are searching for first principles, that we're fighting over fundamental issues of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those self-evident truths, right? Anybody who doesn't acknowledge that is missing the point of this political moment, this political crisis that we're in. So let's now turn to America. Let's talk about America. It is once again time for me to talk to you about the all-important task of building the Young Heretics financial empire. I need all of my listeners to be as fabulously wealthy as possible, and American Hartford Gold can help with that. Here is how. Inflation is out of control. Our government does not understand basic economics. They print money like there's no tomorrow, and that means everything is getting more expensive. And when that happens, your savings shrink in relation to all of the things that you want to buy. American Hartford Gold can show you how to hedge your hard-earned savings against inflation by helping you diversify a portion of your portfolio into physical gold and silver. This is a great way, one of the excellent ways, one of the best ways to guard against inflation, which is going up. If you give them a call right now, they will give you a special deal just for Young Heretics listeners, $1,500 of free silver on your first qualifying order. That's $1,500 of free silver when you text Heretics, Heretics, to 65532. One more time, you text Heretics, the word Heretics, to the number 65532 for $1,500 worth of free silver on your first qualifying order. American Hartford Gold is the way to go if you want to shore up your assets against inflation, which you should. Okay, so how is it that first principle talk about axioms, right? Highest truths, ultimate truths, how does that have anything to do with America and what's going on in America today? Well, let me read to you from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, this is what I mean when I talk about knowing where you come from. Whatever argument you want to put forward, whatever your, personal conviction or belief is about faith and God, whatever your quote unquote faith journey, right? You live in a country, right, that was in some sense begun, right, even before the Constitution, that was begun by this declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And something that people don't notice about this famous paragraph is that it proceeds essentially in the form of a logical argument. It lays out its first principles. That all men are created equal. Every that statement is a first principle here, right? That all men are created equal. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Notice that there's a hidden first principle that they may have even thought too obvious to state, which is that there is a Creator, right? That we are created and that our Creator gives us these rights. They come from Him. And then that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Then, right, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And this is kind of an intermediary principle that follows from all this other stuff that they've said. And then they can lay the foundation on such principles and organize its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The next word of this statement is prudence. Prudence indeed may indeed cause other things to happen, right? And I'm not going to go deeply into that part of the statement, but just note, right, that prudence breaks off this first principles argument and brings us into the world of, well, sometimes you have to make compromises, right? Sometimes you can't always live out your first principles in exactly the perfect way that you might want to, right? And so there's a logical split, or two parts to this statement, right? And the first part is laying out these basic first principles, which we hold to be self-evident. And that's why I started talking about self-evidence, right? Because those aren't self-evident things to most people. Like, people that go around in the world, the vast majority of human beings who've been born in the world don't wander around thinking, I think all men are created equal. Like, babies don't come to the world and look at other babies and think all those babies are created equal. And this has been an object of much discussion, of course, in the American tradition. What do they mean is self-evident? They're not self-evident at all. It wasn't self-evident to Sennacherib, the Near Eastern king who razed cities into the ground. It was not evident to him that the people he was enslaving were equal to him. It wasn't self-evident to the Spartans who tossed babies off of cliffs, right? But then it wasn't self-evident that those babies were created equal to the people that were tossing them off of cliffs, right? What can this possibly mean? And this is something that our friend Tom Holland raises in his book Dominion. He talks about the fact that Christianity and this set of Christian beliefs, right, deeply conditions the self-evidence of these first principles. Let me read you his argument, and then let me talk again about this whole self-evidence. So here's page 400 of Dominion. That all men had been created equal and endowed with an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were not remotely self-evident truths. That most Americans believed they were owed less to philosophy than to the Bible, to the assurance given equally to Christians and Jews, to Protestants and Catholics, to Calvinists and Quakers, that every human being was created in God's image, the truest and ultimate seedbed of the American Republic, no matter what some of those who had composed its founding documents might have cared to think, was the book of Genesis. So Tom is saying something here that is crucial, which is that the self-evidence of the Creator endowing everyone with the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes from somewhere. It comes from this set of Judeo-Christian first principles, which is to say, pistis, faith, belief, right? That bedrock of belief, that sort of unarguable, this just is true, the end of all the toddler's why questions, right? Is faith, is the belief in the God of the Bible who creates all men equal, all men in his image, right? And Holland is saying without that set of convictions, nothing is self-evident about this. And so they must be talking about self-evidence in this second way, the more difficult Aristotelian way, not just immediately obvious to any person who happens to be wandering around the world, but self-evident once you see it, once through training and centuries of work and thought and Western tradition, right? And indeed the thought that we talk about on this show, over centuries, that truth becomes revealed. And once it is revealed, its self-evidence is undeniable. You can simply state it and men's hearts respond, right? And so this is why self-evidence is such an important concept, is because the founders were basically laying the foundation stone of the country on this self-evident truth that had emerged out of centuries, over centuries of Judeo-Christian thought. You may not like Judeo-Christian thought. You may not believe in the Bible. That's what's there. That's what's written. And in order to understand even what kind of country we live in and what sort of arguments we're having, we need to know that self-evidence of the kind that the founders were talking about was the highest possible form of Aristotelian self-evidence that comes from first principles over time, gradually, with experience, learning and thinking, right? And if you do not retain that record of wisdom, that record of tradition, and keep training people in the thought that led us to these self-evident truths, these first principles, then they won't be self-evident to people anymore. And, you know, this is actually something that the founders understood. I've quoted to you a million times from John Adams' letter to the Massachusetts militia about the fact that the Constitution cannot survive without a moral and religious people. Why might that be? Why, you know, if you've got these laws written down, you've got all these rules set out in this neat, handy document, right? It's going to tell you how to do things. Why would it be that you can't understand it without a moral and religious people? Well, here's what George Washington says in his farewell address, 1796. He says, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. This is crucial. You cannot understand what country you're living in unless you understand what the founders thought about how they were writing, what the point of the Constitution was, and the context of the Constitution. There was somebody on Twitter, I can't even remember now who it was, so I'm not going to send you to it because it's no point like clicking on dumb tweets. But there was somebody on Twitter, you'll have to take my word for it, who quoted the Adams letter and cut religion out. I said moral ... people or something, right? To cut this idea of religion out. The foolishness of that is shown in this farewell address, right? That religion, the training over centuries of people to see the self-evident truths that are stated in the Declaration, right? That religion is indispensable because it is a first principle, because it is the thing that we all have to agree on in order to argue about whether or not such and such a person should have the right to life, right? In order to have that argument in a way that does not dissolve into fist fighting, right, we have to agree on the self-evidence of the principle, which comes from the Bible, which comes from histories of study, which comes from our founding documents, right? We have to agree on the first principle that all men are created equal. It's not obvious. It doesn't drop from the sky in some kind of prepackaged bow. It comes to us from our history, from our traditions, and from our pistis, from our faith. And if we're going to have any hope of arguing in this country, there is no escaping. There is no secularizing away the fact that first principles set the table for debate. We cannot have this conversation unless we begin from the first principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that are guaranteed to all men by their Creator. All right, that's enough for one day. We're going to talk about how this works in the abortion debate next week. So I know we talk a lot about your immortal soul, but I don't want to neglect your SOLE soul, that is the sole of your foot. Company called Sole, S-O-L-E, is sponsoring Young Heretics. I'm extremely excited to tell you about them. They make footbeds, which is maybe not something that you've heard of, but it's definitely something that you need if you are active at all, which of course you should be. Your feet take a beating when you walk, when you run, when you, I don't know, golf or whatever you do. I'm a weightlifter, so with deadlifts especially, I love to use Sole footbeds because they realign the base of your feet so that you're not injuring yourself, to sort of resolve a lot of the tension that you might not even know that you have. They also make flip-flops, which I wear around the house all the time because they're super comfy. After 28 years of delivering comfort, Sole does not just make footbeds, but they are the foundation around which all Sole footwear styles are built. They have all kinds of great stuff. Just for Young Heretics listeners, when you go to yoursole.com/heretics, you can get 50% off your first purchase, which is an incredible deal. Half off when you go to yoursole.com/heretics. One more time, it's yoursole.com/heretics. It's the comfort that you never knew you needed. You will not know what hits you when you start using these. Trust me, go to yoursole.com/heretics and get 50% off. All mailbag questions must come to me through Locals. If you are not a VIP on Locals, you will be in the sad exterior darkness, wondering aloud about profound questions that you cannot get answered. But if you are a VIP, you can ask me mailbag questions and I will answer them on the show. Plus, you get all sorts of extra stuff. All joking aside, this really is an incredible community. VIPs on Locals are the folks that want to take this stuff deeper, apply it to daily life, talk about it in our own individual experiences and what we're reading, what we're thinking about. I do, exclusive articles on there that you can only read if you're a VIP. I'm currently doing a commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, and some of the thoughts in this episode came out of that commentary, so you can see kind of where that thinking is developing from. But we do live stream Q&As and all sorts of stuff to kind of connect and go deeper on this stuff on this show. We are doing a limited time promo just for this episode. When you use the offer code AXIOM, which is AXIOM, you can get a month free off of your annual subscription. So you go to youngheretics.com/locals, pick the annual subscription, which is the best deal anyway, and then enter AXIOM, AXIOM, to get a month free. Really hope to see you there. Here is a mailbag question from Jonathan. Hello, Mr. Klavan. Why, hello. My family has been discussing an idea from a book we've been reading. It is about this, essentially. God created other lesser gods. in Job, it talks about God being among the council of the heavenly realm. In the Hebrew, it is not angels, but other lesser gods. It also states that it is not Satan, but the Satan, ha-satan, as apparently in the Hebrew, Satan is a description akin to a prosecutor. Yes, an accuser. In Exodus, it also says that when God takes his people out of Egypt, he would curse their gods. The idea is that when the Tower of Babel was struck, he divided their language and gave each nation their own gods, which is why Satan, or the Satan, was able to offer it to Jesus. Okay, this is a really interesting question, and it ties in perfectly with the episode that we've just done, this first principle question that we've just been talking about. There is a fascinating issue in Hebrew scripture. All of what we Christians would call the Old Testament, but what Jews would just call scripture, right? Especially in the Torah and the earlier parts, but everywhere you have this idea of Elohim. And that word is usually just translated as God. But as Jonathan points out, right, there are many beings that are described as Elohim. In Psalm 8, it's said that human beings are made me'at me Elohim, which is just a little bit less than the gods. And as Jonathan says, it's not angels. Sometimes you translate this as angels, but it's not angels. It says a little bit below the gods. And then, of course, we have, thou shalt have no other gods than me, right? He puts other gods to shame. One of my favorite ways of talking about this is that the early parts of the Hebrew Bible are not just monotheistic, they are monolatrous, which is to say there are many different possible gods. Yahweh is the one, right? This tetragrammaton, this four-letter word, Yod He Vav He, which you see sometimes is written as YHWH or something like that, right? This is the God that you shall worship, not those other guys, because they can't help you. They're made of wood, they're made of stone, people pray to them. I mean, think of the Greek gods, right? These temples that they would have these statues they would pray to, or indeed the idols of the Canaanites and the kind of other local people in and around Israel, right? The Bible sometimes talks as if these are gods too, but they're not the God that you're supposed to worship. At the same time, right, there's the famous Shema, which is a word just meaning listen, and it stands in for this invocation. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, the Lord is God, right? How can it be that there are other gods in this famously monotheistic faith? How is it that this monolatry happens, right? The choosing of one idol or one kind of idolatry over others. Think of it this way. Yod He Vav He, which is the tetragrammaton, which is the name of God. Nobody knows what the vowels are. It's not to be spoken, right? There's this real mystique and mystery around the tetragrammaton. Is kind of like a personal name. It's like Joe or Bob. And so when in the Shema it says, the Lord is God, right? What you can kind of think of that as saying like, Bob is God, right? Like that dude is God. This is God. All the other gods are not God. And so there's this double way of talking that, yes, these are beings that are somehow above us, and yet we are not to worship them. We're not to fall down before them. We're not to consider them the highest good. Remember when I was talking about how you can have all sorts of other kinds of first principles besides God, right? You can trust in your checkbook. You can trust in your smarts. You can trust in your good looks, right? No matter what, mankind is a worshiping being, right? Man is by nature a being who worships. And part of what that means is that our thought, all of our thought proceeds according to those first principles, those highest truths. And so even if the other gods that people put up in their head, the idols that they have, Baal, right? And wealth and money, right? Even if those gods did not create the world, if they're not all powerful, if they aren't the real God, nevertheless, they function as gods for us. They have this power over us. And so the Bible talks about them as if they were kind of godlike powers that we worship instead of God. Now, there are, as you mentioned, right, there are also angels, right? There are other powers that are above us that are good, right? And sometimes we make those good powers into evil idols, right? And because we can take certain good things as our highest good, like freedom, right? Even freedom is a good, right? It's something according to which we might order our life, but it's not the only good, as we know, because you don't have freedom to murder somebody. So if you really made an idol out of freedom, even though freedom is a good, right? Kind of an angel, right? It's like the angel of freedom. Even though that is a good first principle, there is a higher first principle, which is God. And if you put freedom above God, above the moral truth, above the absolute good, right, then you have turned this good angel into an idol, into an evil being. And so the Bible is actually really good at talking about this. It basically says there are all sorts of gods available to you, meaning there are all sorts of things that you might make into the highest good because they are higher than you, right? Freedom is higher than us. It's a principle that is above us. But if you worship it, if you put it above all other things, including God, then you will make it into an idol and it will destroy you. Very, very cool thing that you can investigate, right? You can, once you understand how this works, and once you know to look at the Hebrew, you can find all sorts of wonderful verses, like the one that I just mentioned, that we are a little bit lower than the angels, and understand them in this way, right? That if you understand what we would call first principles as these kind of governing forces in our lives, and if you understand the call to worship God as the call not to have any other gods before me, right? You shall have no other gods that are above Yahweh, that are above Bob, right? That guy, that dude, our man, we might say, Jesus, right? Christians say above Jesus. Then you understand what the Bible is even talking about. It's talking about a whole range of competing goods in the world that you might worship instead of God. When push comes to shove, when everything else is left on the table, what are you going to trust in? You're going to trust in your money, you're going to trust in your fame, your wealth, your good looks, your smarts, what? None of those things will satisfy. Even if they are good, they are all false gods because God is higher than all of them. Thank you, Jonathan. That's a great question. One more time, if you want to ask questions like this and to get into discussions like this, you can go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP. A limited time only. Enter promo code AXIOM, AXIOM, and you'll get a month free off of your annual subscription. That's it for me. It is always a pleasure to be with you. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and The American Mind, both dedicated to the recovery of the American idea, which of course was much on our minds today and will be again next week. So great place to go to learn more about that is ClaremontReviewBooks.com or AmericanMind.org or Claremont.org/donate to support our work. Mention in the notes that you heard about us through Young Heretics, and you will make me smile. Thanks, folks. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.